call came on a Tuesday morning while I was elbow deep in a patient's discharge paperwork and already running 40 minutes behind. I almost didn't answer. The number was local but unfamiliar, and I had a habit of letting unknown calls go to voicemail. Something made me stop. Maybe it was the way my phone buzzed differently. Longer, more insistent, though that's not actually possible. Or maybe some part of me already knew. Is this Lydia Harmon? The voice on the other end was calm, measured. A man who delivered news for a living. Speaking, I said, stepping into the hallway outside the nurse's station. My name is Gerald Whitfield. I'm an attorney based in Asheville. I'm calling regarding the estate of your uncle, Robert Harmon. I'm very sorry for your loss. I sat down on a plastic chair that wasn't there for sitting. A passing orderly gave me a look. I didn't care. Uncle Robert, the only person in my family who had ever called me just to ask how I was doing. He was 71. He'd been in good health the last I'd heard. But the last I'd heard was 3 months ago, because I was a 34-year-old ICU nurse working back-to-back 12-hour shifts, and I kept telling myself I'd call him back when things slowed down. Things never slowed down. I never called him back. That guilt was going to live in me for a long time. Ms. Harmon, the attorney said gently, your uncle left a will. You are the primary beneficiary. I'd like to schedule a time to meet with you at your earliest convenience. I pressed my palm flat against my knee to keep my hand from shaking. How soon? I asked. Whenever you're ready, he said, but there are some time-sensitive matters attached to the estate. I'd recommend within the week. I drove to Asheville that Saturday. Uncle Robert had lived in the mountains his whole adult life. In a farmhouse he'd spent 30 years restoring board by board. I'd visited twice as a child and once as an adult, the summer after nursing school. He'd made me coffee on a cast-iron stove, and we'd sat on the porch watching the fog move through the valley below. And he told me that the best thing a person could do with money was to keep enough to live decently and give the rest to something that mattered. He'd never married. No children. He'd been a civil engineer who'd started a small land surveying firm in his 40s, and somewhere along the way the land itself had become valuable. Western North Carolina had changed. The mountains were no longer remote. People with money from Charlotte and Atlanta had discovered them, and suddenly Uncle Robert's 43 acres with a renovated farmhouse and creek access were worth something none of us had anticipated. Gerald Whitfield's office was on the second floor of a building downtown, above a coffee shop. He was a compact man in his 60s, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the particular kind of patience that comes from watching families tear themselves apart over dining room tables and savings accounts. He shook my hand and offered me water. I took it. Your uncle left everything to you, he said, opening a folder on his desk. The property, valued at approximately $1.4 million. Investments and retirement accounts totaling just over $900,000. And a life insurance policy with a named beneficiary, you, in the amount of $750,000. I set my water glass down very carefully. I started. Just over $3 million total, yes. He folded his hands. He was very deliberate about this. He revised the will 11 months ago. Everything was updated, notarized, and witnessed. It's ironclad. I thought about Uncle Robert on that porch. The fog in the valley, the cast-iron coffee. Why me? I asked. Not ungrateful, just genuinely confused. I had a father. I had a mother. I had an older brother named Kevin who had always been their favorite, and who had, from what I understood, a much better relationship with our extended family than I'd ever managed. Gerald looked at me carefully. He addressed that in the letter he left for you. I'd like you to read it before we discuss next steps. He slid an envelope across the desk. Cream-colored, sealed with tape rather than wax, Uncle Robert's handwriting on the front. Just my name. Lydia. I didn't open it there. I thanked Gerald, took his card, shook his hand again, and walked down to my car. I sat in the parking lot above the coffee shop for a long time before I finally broke the seal. His handwriting was cramped and tilted, the way it had always been. Lydia, if you're reading this, I'm gone. And Gerald has done his job. Good man, Gerald. I want you to know that I didn't make this decision lightly. I thought about it for a long time. You're the one who called me back, always. You're the one who drove up here just to sit on the porch and not talk about anything important. I'm old enough to know that's the rarest thing there is. I know your parents will not take this well. I want you to be prepared for that. I've spoken with Gerald at length about what's possible and what isn't, and he'll protect you. But you need to be ready for them to show up. They will show up. I'm sorry I can't be there to run interference. Keep the creek property, at least for a while. Sit on the porch. The fog comes in around 5 on most mornings. Love, Robert. I read it 4 times, then I folded it back into the envelope and drove the 3 hours home with the radio off. I need to explain something about my parents before I tell you what happened next. They didn't beat me or lock me in a closet. There was no dramatic moment of cruelty I can point to. What happened with us was slower and quieter than that, and in some ways harder to name. I was 16 when my father's construction business started failing. By the time I was 17, we were behind on the mortgage and the tension in our house had gone from uncomfortable to suffocating. My mother managed it by pretending nothing was wrong. My father managed it by becoming someone I didn't recognize, short-tempered, secretive, increasingly focused on finding someone to blame. The someone he found was often me, not in any dramatic way, just in the accumulation of 1,000 small things. The college fund they promised that had quietly ceased to exist, the financial aid forms they refused to sign, then signed incorrectly, then blamed me for the processing delays, the way they'd started referring to my nursing school ambitions as impractical and expensive and not what this family needs right now. I applied for every scholarship I could find. I worked 30 hours a week at a coffee shop while carrying a full course load. I took out federal loans in my own name, the maximum amount allowed each year. I had a bank account my parents didn't know about. I'd opened it at 18 at the credit union 2 towns over, and every paycheck went straight in. I say this because later, people will wonder how I survived. That's how. Not luck. Not a secret stash. A credit union account, a full-time study schedule, and a stubborn refusal to believe that what my family said about me was true. Uncle Robert called me every month during those 4 years. He never offered money. I never asked. But he asked questions. Real questions. How's your clinical rotation? What's the hardest part? What did you learn this week? I don't think he understood how much those calls meant. I don't think I understood it either until I was sitting in that parking lot in Asheville holding his handwriting. My parents and I had settled into a kind of cordial distance by the time I finished school. I visited at Christmas. I called on birthdays. We didn't discuss anything real. I had moved to Charlotte, started my career, built a small and carefully arranged life that had almost nothing to do with the house I'd grown up in. I thought that was fine. I thought I had made peace with it. Uncle Robert, apparently, had been paying closer attention. I told exactly one person about the inheritance that first week. My best friend, a fellow nurse named Serena, who sat across from me at our usual diner booth on a Tuesday evening and listened without interrupting until I was finished. Robert said they'd show up, I said. Smart man, she said. I don't know what they'd even argue. He had the right to leave his estate to whoever he wanted. She looked at me the way she looks at patients' family members who are in denial. Patient, waiting. Lydia, she said. You know what they're going to argue. I did know. I just didn't want to say it out loud yet. I called Gerald the next morning. My parents found out 11 days after I met with Gerald. I'll never know exactly how, whether a cousin mentioned it or they'd somehow maintained a relationship with someone in Uncle Robert's orbit. It doesn't matter. What matters is that my mother called on a Thursday night while I was eating leftover soup at my kitchen counter, and her voice had that particular tone that meant she had been rehearsing this conversation. We heard about Robert, she said. We're so sorry, sweetheart. We've been meaning to reach out. They hadn't called when he died. I'd sent a text to let them know, and my mother had responded with a heart emoji. That was 3 weeks ago. Thank you, I said carefully. We thought we might come down this weekend. Your father and I. We'd love to see you. And there are some things we should probably talk about. There it is, I thought. I'm working this weekend, I said. Which was true. Maybe the following week. There was a pause. Lydia, we know about the will. I put my spoon down. There are some things about your uncle's estate that are, well, they're complicated. We've spoken with someone about it. A legal advisor. What kind of legal advisor? I asked, even though I already knew the answer wasn't going to be anything good. Another pause. Longer this time. The thing is, sweetheart, your uncle's estate is significant, and there are certain family considerations that Robert may not have been fully. He was getting older, Lydia. He may not have been thinking clearly. I had been holding it together through the heart emoji and the delayed condolences and the "we'd love to see you" opener. That sentence broke something open. He updated his will 11 months ago, I said. His attorney told me it's fully documented and witnessed. There's no question about his mental capacity. We're not questioning his mental capacity, my mother said quickly, which told me that was exactly what they were planning to question. Mom. I took a breath. What do you actually want to say? The silence that followed was the longest yet. And then my father's voice came on. He'd been listening the whole time, I realized. And he said, "We think you should talk to your brother." Kevin called the next morning. My brother was 41 and had spent most of his adult life borrowing money from our parents and occasionally from extended family members, then finding reasons why repayment wasn't currently possible. He'd done this with enough charm and just enough follow-through that most people still liked him, which I'd always found impressive in a bleak kind of way. "Hey, Lydia," he said. He was the only person who called me that. It had always worked on me before. "I heard about Uncle Robert." "I'm sorry, I know you were close." I said, "so listen." A pause. The sound of him settling into a chair. Mom and Dad are pretty upset. They feel like, look, Robert was Dad's brother. And to not leave anything to his own brother, he had the right to leave his estate to whoever he chose, I said. He chose me. I know. Kevin's voice was still warm, still reasonable. That was his talent. But here's the thing. Dad's been struggling, Liddy. The business never really recovered after, And Mom's health stuff last year cost them a lot. If Robert had known he knew, I said. He made his decision. There was a different kind of pause then. The warmth didn't leave Kevin's voice exactly, but something shifted behind it. They've talked to a lawyer about contesting. I looked at the ceiling of my apartment. On what grounds? Undue influence, he said. They're saying you had a closer relationship with him than anyone else in the family, and that you may have used that too. I actually laughed. I didn't mean to. It came out before I could stop it. Kevin, I said. I visited him once in the last 6 years. I called him on the phone. That's the relationship. That's all it was. That's more than anyone else had, he said. And for a moment, something honest moved across his voice. Something almost sad. He never called me back, Kevin said quietly. Every time I called, he'd say he'd call back, and he never did. I didn't know what to say to that. Maybe nothing would have been right. I'm sorry, I said finally. And I meant it, though I wasn't sure exactly what I was apologizing for. They're going to file, Kevin said. I thought you should know before it happened. Gerald was not surprised. Undue influence claims are filed regularly in estate situations, he told me when I came back to Asheville that weekend. They're also almost universally unsuccessful when the estate planning is documented as thoroughly as your uncle's was. He opened another folder. This one was thicker. Your uncle was very deliberate, Lydia. He kept records. Every interaction with the attorney's office over the past 3 years is documented. He had a cognitive evaluation performed 14 months ago. His physician administered it, and the results are on file. He wrote notes. Extensive notes. About his reasons for his decisions. He set a stapled sheaf of pages on the desk between us. He wrote about your parents specifically, Gerald said. About his relationship with his brother. About the loans that were never repaid. About conversations he'd had. Decisions he'd seen made. He was building a case before they could build one. I stared at the pages. Uncle Robert's tilted handwriting covered the margins. He knew, I thought. He knew exactly what they'd do. Your aunt's letter, Gerald said gently, misreading my expression. Take it home. Read it when you're ready. I took it home. I read it at my kitchen table at 2 in the morning, a cup of tea going cold at my elbow. It was 31 pages, handwritten. His account of 40 years of his brother's choices, the borrowed money, the unpaid debts, the phone calls that only came when something was needed. His account of watching me from a distance build something solid out of almost nothing. His account of why. Never asked me for anything, he wrote near the end. I want that to mean something. I was crying by the time I finished, the ugly kind, with no dignity in it. I sat at my kitchen table and let it happen, and then I washed my face and went to bed. The legal process took 4 months. My parents filed a petition to contest the will. Gerald responded. There were depositions. There was documentation. My father hired an attorney who specialized in estate litigation, and who, Gerald informed me neutrally, had a solid reputation and would likely be expensive. I kept working. I kept showing up to my shifts. I called Gerald every 2 weeks for updates and tried not to think about it in between, with limited success. My mother sent me emails during this period. Careful, measured emails that never mentioned the legal proceedings directly, but circled them constantly, like weather systems looking for a place to land. She wrote about how much she missed me, about how hard things had been, about how family was the only thing that mattered in the end. I read everyone. I didn't respond to any of them. Kevin went quiet. I'd expected him to keep pushing, but he didn't. Once, about 6 weeks in, he texted me just, "How are you holding up?" I wrote back, "Fine. You?" He didn't reply. I didn't follow up. The turning point came in the 3rd month, when my parents' attorney submitted a request to have Uncle Robert's cognitive evaluation records sealed. Apparently, their strategy had shifted toward challenging the evaluation's validity. Gerald called me that evening. "They're overreaching," he said. "This tells me they know the core claim isn't working. When they start challenging the procedure rather than the substance, they're running out of options." 2 weeks later, their attorney withdrew from the case. My mother called the next day. I knew before I answered what the call was. Something in me had been waiting for it. "Lydia." Her voice was different. The rehearsed quality was gone. What was underneath it was harder to name. Tired, maybe. Or just old. "We're dropping the petition." "Okay," I said. "I want you to know." She stopped. Started again. "I want you to know that none of this was about the money." I didn't say anything to that. What would I say? We felt like Robert should have. She stopped again. "It doesn't matter. We're done. We wanted you to know." "I appreciate you telling me," I said, which was the truest thing I could offer. After I hung up, I sat very still for a while. I'd expected to feel something large, relief, maybe, or anger, finally releasing, or some version of triumph. What I actually felt was something much smaller and much sadder. A door closing that had been open for a very long time, the kind of door you always think you might walk back through someday, until one day you understand that you won't. I took a week off work in the spring. I drove up to Asheville on a Sunday afternoon and turned down the county road I'd only been on a few times in my life and pulled up to the farmhouse as the light was going golden across the ridge. The property manager, Gerald, had arranged let me in and handed me the keys and left me there. The farmhouse smelled like wood and thyme and something faint I couldn't identify. Old books, maybe. A specific kind of soap. Uncle Robert. I walked through every room slowly. His books were still on the shelves. His cast-iron pans were still on the stove. In the back bedroom that he'd used as an office, there was a whiteboard on the wall covered in calculations I'd never understand, and next to it, taped with regular masking tape, a photograph I recognized. It was me, 17 years old, at a family gathering I barely remembered, squinting into the sun. Somebody's backyard. A picnic table in the background. I didn't know he'd had it. I didn't know he'd kept it. I stood in that doorway for a long time. In the morning, I woke early and made coffee on the cast-iron stove the way he'd showed me years ago, and I carried it out to the porch, and I sat in the chair that still held the shape of him, and at 5 o'clock exactly the fog came rolling in across the valley below, slow and white and absolute, swallowing the tree line and the creek, and every hard thing I'd been carrying for as long as I could remember. I watched it until the sun burned it off. Then I went inside and made breakfast. I kept the property. Gerald had asked at one point early on whether I'd thought about selling. It would simplify things, he said, and the market was good. I told him I'd think about it. I thought about it. The answer was no. I'm still a nurse. I go to work. I do my shifts. The financial change is real. I paid off my student loans, which I had been carrying for 11 years, in a single transaction, and I am still not entirely used to the feeling of that absence. But the rest of my life looks mostly the same. I didn't want it to look different. I wanted to be the person I'd already made myself into, just with less weight behind me. I talk to Kevin occasionally. Not often. There's no hostility, but there's also not much bridge left. He knows that I know that he knew, and I know that he knows that I know, and we both understand that some things don't reconstruct once they've been taken apart. My parents and I don't speak. I think about that sometimes, how quiet it is, and how I'm not sure anymore whether quiet means peaceful or just empty, and how maybe those two things are closer than I ever understood. What I know is this. Uncle Robert sat on that porch for 30 years, watching fog come in across a valley, and he decided that what mattered was not obligation or blood, or the expectations people construct around you without your consent. What mattered was who called back, who showed up without wanting something, who sat next to you in the cold morning and didn't need the silence to mean anything. He left me everything because I came to the porch. I'm trying to deserve that. Every day I go to work and I sit with people in the hardest moments of their lives, and I call back when I say I'll call back. And I try to be the kind of person who notices what matters before it's too late. The fog comes in around 5 most mornings. I've started getting up to watch it. I used to think that family loyalty was something you were born into, that blood created obligation automatically, the way gravity works, invisible, constant, not something you chose. It took me a long time to understand that loyalty, real loyalty, is something people build through 1,000 small decisions made when nobody is watching and nothing is guaranteed. Uncle Robert understood that before I did. He watched me for years, not intrusively. He wasn't that kind of person. He just paid attention when everyone else had stopped. He called back. He asked real questions. He remembered what I'd told him 3 months earlier and followed up on it. Those are small things. They don't feel like much in the moment, but they accumulate into something, and what they accumulate into is trust. The kind that doesn't need to announce itself. My parents made a different set of decisions, not dramatically terrible ones. I want to be clear about that because I think the easy version of the story makes them into villains, and the truth is more complicated. They were people under pressure who made themselves smaller, and in doing so, they made everyone around them smaller too. They prioritized what was disappearing over what was being built. And when I built something anyway, without their help, they didn't see it as proof of my resilience. They saw it as a resource. That's the thing about people who see the world through scarcity. Everything becomes something to extract. What I learned, and I don't use that phrase lightly, because I think most of what we call lessons are just things we tell ourselves to make pain feel purposeful. What I actually learned is that character is cumulative. Every time I called Uncle Robert back, I wasn't doing it to earn anything. I called because he was worth calling. Because talking to him left me feeling steadier than I'd been before. Because he was one of the few people in my life who treated my ambitions as real, rather than inconvenient. And every time my parents didn't call, didn't show up, chose the easier path over the honest one, they were also accumulating something. Just something different. The estate attorneys, the legal filings, the 4 months of proceedings, none of that is what the story is really about. That was just the mechanism. The actual story is about what 30 years of small choices look like when they finally have to be accounted for. Uncle Robert sat on that porch and watched the fog come in, and he made his decisions quietly and carefully and with full knowledge of what they would set in motion. He wasn't naive. He knew my parents would contest it. He prepared for exactly that. He left behind 31 handwritten pages because he understood that integrity without documentation is just a feeling, and feelings don't hold up in court. I think about that a lot, about the difference between meaning well and doing the actual work of meaning well, about how easy it is to tell yourself you're a good person while doing none of the things that would prove it. I'm still learning. I still fall short of what I want to be. But I get up early now and I make coffee on a cast iron stove, and I watch the fog come in across a valley that Uncle Robert loved, and I try to be someone worth paying attention to. That's all any of us can do. Show up. Call back. Be worth the trust someone placed in you before you even knew they were watching.